Hey everybody, welcome to the class. This is World History 1112, and you're all probably in the right place, or else otherwise you wouldn't have been able to log in to D2L. We're doing this thing over the summer, online, asynchronous. What does that mean? You've signed up for it. Here we are. Let's check it out. So here's our class, History 1112, Survey World History 2. That's the second part of world history. Typically it's from 1500 up until about present. You do not have to have taken the first part, doesn't matter. It just kind of means what time we're covering. Summer 2021. Also, we're going to be online, asynchronous. A lot of you probably know what that means now because you've been through it this last year. Maybe some of your classes were all online, maybe they were part online. This one is only online, and it means we'll never actually meet per person, per class, something like that. We're not gonna, here, let me just adjust that, yeah. We're not going to have a scheduled time that we all meet or anything like that, so it'll be really important to communicate via email, phone, whatever you want, all that sort of thing. We'll get to that in a little bit, maybe. All right, so there's me, Professor Robert Finley. My office is in I-3109. Although I probably won't be around there very much over the summer, that's not a great way to get a hold of me. Plus, none of you want to go out to that building if you know it's the one that's like way out there that used to be a hotel or whatever. Instead, you definitely want to email me. That's the easiest way to get a hold of me. Unfortunately, I'm checking that email all the time, so whenever you email me, I can usually get back to you pretty quick, within a couple hours. Maybe at the most, it's going to be like a day or two or something if it's like on the weekend, you know. So rfinley@ggc.edu. Also, for those of you who might not know, all of us GGC professors have cell phones that are our work phones. So you can go ahead and call or text me. I probably won't pick up. I don't have that thing on me all the time. But if you do want to talk over the phone about any of the course material, any of the requirements, about the actual lectures, whatever, that's totally cool. The easiest way to do that, again, is to email me, and then we can just set up a time that works for both of us so that we can get right on it. I'm glad I'm not wearing that shirt I'm wearing in this picture. I think that happened last year, so progress. Okay, so you're probably wondering about the basics of this class. What are the course requirements? What are we actually covering? What are we talking about? What is modern history anyway? I kind of already said that. So let's get right into it. The syllabus is in the course information folder. I'll also put it in this introductory module as well, so that you have multiple places you can find the syllabus. It'll have all this information on it in a little bit more written out detail if you want to go over it, or if I'm talking too fast or anything like that. Although you can go back and replay this, or just, yeah, check out the syllabus, email me questions, all that sort of thing. So what are the course requirements? The first thing that you might like to know, and how this is going to be different than maybe some of your other classes, is there is no required textbook. Normally for this class, we cover all of this material in 15 weeks. So I have students reading about a chapter a week and things like that. The way this class is set up, we're covering all the material in 3 weeks plus 1 day, although that 1 day is maybe the 4th of July, so I don't want you working on that day. So we have about 3 weeks to cover 15 weeks worth of material. It's not that practical to have you read a whole textbook and watch all these lectures and do the quizzes and all this other stuff in that time. So there is a textbook for the class, Traditions and Encounters, but it is completely optional. It's in the bookstore and it's listed online as required. The reason I did that is bureaucratic only. For some people, for their scholarships or for financial aid, they can't use them, or they're not supposed to use them to buy books if the books are listed as optional. So I went ahead and listed all those books as required for my classes so that you can jump in there and buy that book if you want it. Really, the book is great. The book really rides along with the class just right. At the end of each lecture, I'll tell you like what the reading would be for next time. But it's really not required. The way I've tried to set this up with the modules, as we'll see in a second, means you shouldn't have to be doing this reading. You shouldn't have to be doing a lot of extra stuff outside the class. Hopefully that'll kind of streamline it. if you do want to buy this book and you do want to, textbooks just work for you and that's cool, there's a ton of them used floating around. So you can probably buy them online somewhere for a lot cheaper than the bookstore. Get an old copy, something like that. So you might want to know how you're graded for the course. Basically, the course has 135 points possible. At the end, I add up all the points you got. That's it. There's 7 quizzes. They're really short. They're 5 points each. That's 35 points. There's 7 written responses. Those are worth 10. So at the end, that's 70 points. There's a final for the class. That's 30 points. There's your 135 points. And then you just basically get a percentage of that. So those quick quizzes in each module, there will be, after you check out what's in there, after you check out the lecture videos and get a sense of the material, there's these little quick quizzes. They're really just to check in. I put the recommended time limit at 10 minutes or something. If you're taking more than 10 minutes, it probably means you didn't watch the lecture or you didn't get into the material all that much or something. You have as much time as you want, but really you won't need more than that. They're really just kind of check in. Most of them are true false kind of things, just to kind of see if you're on the same page or get going. But you do have to do each one in order. So after you watch this video in this sort of introduction module, you can take the quiz, and then the next one will be open and all that sort of stuff. So overall, these quizzes are going to be a quarter of your grade, about. The bulk of your grade is going to come from these written responses. So in each module, there's also a written response, about 250, 300 words, something like that. Again, you want to do them in order, right? So you're going to do the whole first module, the whole second module, stuff like that. And these are not supposed to be really hard. It's not necessarily like you're writing a paper. Think of it a little bit more like you're writing journal responses, or you're writing discussion questions. They're to help you sort of process the material, come up with thoughts, relate it to yourself, get that material working in your brain, get it back out there, and sort of let me see how you're thinking about the material, what you're doing with it. You'll see they're not really hard. They're not asking you to do research. They're not asking you to go out and look up a bunch of stuff or something like that. It's really just about the material and then some of your interpretations and how you're working with it. So you can see what the one is like for this module, and the second and third one will be open as well. Then finally, there will be a final exam. That is scheduled for July 19th. There'll be a sort of timed window to take the test. I'm not sure what it is yet, but we'll have like a 12-hour window on that day, something like that, where you can log in. And once you log in, you'll have like 2 hours or 2.5 hours to take the test. Most people won't need that long. I will post a study guide about halfway through the class, just so you really know what's coming, and it will be available for you. Also, we can check in, we can talk about it. If you guys have questions or whatever, maybe I'll open up a sort of discussion post to talk about that. And in the end, that's going to be worth about a quarter of your grade as well. So what about the basic sort of chronology of the material we're going to cover, of the period we're going to cover? The way this class is set up is it's broken down into 7 modules. This first one is just an introduction, but the rest sort of cover a specific theme in world history. They're in order. I'll kind of show you what I mean. So the first module is an introduction. I'm just trying to lay out a little bit for you what this class is all about, how it works. You can check out the syllabus. It's meant to be pretty short. It's also meant for you to have an opportunity to ask any questions you want from me about the class, about GGC, about the summer schedule, about your fall schedule. I don't care. This is a great time to ask me whatever you want, and I can get back to you really quickly and just kind of make sure we're all on the same page. Module 2 is when we start actually getting into the sort of material, the history. Module 2, When Worlds Collide, is this period from about 1450 to 1750. You might know right around the start of there, 1492, 1500, something like that. Afro-Eurasians, that is like people from Europe and Africa and Asia, start to come into prolonged contact with the Americas. The two hemispheres, East and West, come together for the first time in a very, very, very long time, the first time in sort of human existence anyway, in a meaningful sense, and it leads to all of these new exchanges. You get a global economy for the first time, but you also get completely new foods, diseases, new populations, new countries, all kinds of stuff as a result. And by the end of this period, Europeans start to have a big place on the world stage. If you took the first half of world history, or if you've studied some of this stuff before, you might know that Europeans are not really central to world history very much at all until this period. They're sort of the backwater of Afro-Eurasia. There's no European kingdoms or empires or anything on the scale of China or India or other places after Rome. So it's a bit tricky, but we'll get to all that sort of stuff. Module 3 is about transatlantic slavery and the world. I often hear, particularly you all that probably went to school in Georgia, most of you, that you've just been hit over the head with this stuff and you've really had this in middle school and high school and all these sorts of things. But I guarantee you, if you get into it, I present this in a way that they don't in most high schools, I'm sure, and hopefully can be something interesting worth thinking about or kind of worth getting into in this module. We'll talk about transatlantic slavery, how it happened, the development of the sort of Atlantic world, what that means, and we'll start to talk a little bit about creolization. And that's really just a fancy word for mixing up, basically, right? Making something new. It's not the kind of Creole from Louisiana. That's a different sort of thing. We'll talk about that when we get there. It's not the kind of Creole Beyonce told you about. It's something different. So it basically means just a mixing of all these new cultures from the Americas, from Africa, from Europe. They all kind of create something new in the Caribbean and in the Americas. We'll check that out. Module 4, the Atlantic Revolutions. So you may know this painting, you may have seen it before, right? This is the French Revolution. This is this really crazy period that definitely you guys all know a little bit about, because one of the major revolutions during this period is the American Revolution. So we'll look a little bit at the Enlightenment in Europe, what that means, the sort of thought that's coming out of that, and how that led to a lot of these revolutions. The first one in the United States, then in France, then in Haiti, and then sort of in the rest of Latin America. And what this looked like. It created a radically new world, a world filled with nation states that we hadn't really seen before. Also, the Haitian Revolution, right, is the first successful, really kind of the only successful slave revolution that led to a new country that just totally broke away from empire. So lots of really interesting stuff there to look at. Module 5, we're definitely getting more towards the modern period, things you'll start to recognize like factories, 1750 to about 1900. We'll look at how machines are made, the beginning of industrialization, what we mean by that, where this new energy is coming from. For most of human history, right, energy just came from plants and animals and the sun. That was what you had. Once the Industrial Revolution starts, something different is at work. There's sort of like fossilized sunshine in the ground, right, that people start finding and can use it to power things like factories, which lead to just a total technological revolution. And in fact, it leads to a whole new set of social conditions that we might call industrial capitalism. We'll look at that. And also, we'll kind of check out how people are not all on board with it and continue to not be on board with it today. This is when communism comes up. This is when socialism comes up. These are very old ideas. You might have heard those words recently or being used by conservatives. Often people don't necessarily know what they mean, but we'll get into that a little bit. This is basically just resistance to this really big change towards industrialization and towards capitalism. So we'll see about that a little bit in Module 5. Module 6 will be all focused on the 20th century, this strange period that many of you were probably born either right at the very end of or right after it went away. But the 20th century is a very strange one for humans. It's like the most amazing technological transformative era, all kinds of progress in every direction. It's also the most violent, destructive, war-filled era, where more human beings are killed through violence than in all of our previous history. So those two things kind of go together, and that's really funky. So we'll get into that. We'll look at colonialism, this whole idea about progress, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, where that kind of all ends up, and we'll look during that module a little bit specifically at the United States and other places where these movements are sort of bigger. So we'll try to get a sense of that. And then the last module, Module 7, is about the world today, sort of beginning in 1945, basically after World War II, which I know seems like a really, kind of far ways away, but it sets up a lot of things that we still have around, the suburbs, all the new technology, all that sort of stuff. We'll look at decolonization. We'll look at this just really incredible sort of rapid social change, cultural change. My guess is most of you think of yourselves culturally, socially, as really different from your parents. Maybe they didn't grow up with computers, cell phones, stuff like that. Totally different music, different clothes, different ideas about gender, different ideas about race, like all this sort of stuff. We'll look at environmental change. We'll look at ideas about globalization, all these sorts of things in the sort of modern world as we get closer and closer. And by the last lecture, we'll be right up to things that are going on in the last decade or so, definitely in your lifetime. So definitely maybe connecting it all back through a little bit more to you as an individual. Also along the way, like any class, any history class at least, we'll talk about time, memory, meaning, get a little bit into information literacy, all this sort of stuff. How do we know what we know? How do we think about the past? Do we remember things like they were? Should we? What does all this stuff mean? Anytime you watch the news or read something, people are talking about the past, but how are they talking about it? What are they trying to use it to do? How are they sort of using it to make arguments about the present or the future? So we'll check all that out along the way. All right. So as part of this class, we're going to be talking about this idea of being modern. A lot of you probably think of the word modern as meaning like stuff that's happening right now. If you've taken a philosophy class or something like that, modern means from like 1300. So the term can mean really different stuff. But we'll try to get a sense of what the modern world is like. Certain things, for most of human history just didn't exist. And once they do, they have a really transformative sort of effect on everybody around, every nation, all this sort of thing. So we can have a sort of working definition of modern. It includes things like industrialization, increased global integration, the expansion of political participation, the expansion of mass society, and nation states and nationalism. And it's totally okay if you don't know what all these words mean or whatever. That's why we're doing the class. I'll walk you through just a little bit of it so you can get a sense of where we're going and what all these things tie to. As you're working through the material, we're going to keep hitting on these sorts of points because these are the things that really have created the world that we find ourselves in right now. So industrialization is pretty straightforward. Basically, we're looking at how agrarian societies transformed into industrial societies. Agrarian is just a fancy word for farming. So my guess is none of you are farmers, or very few of you are farmers, and most of you don't really aspire to be farmers in the future. But since about 10,000 years ago, most human beings have been farmers, and that really only changed in the 1900s and 20th century, or the 20th century. So we'll take a look at what that means. We'll take a look at sort of changing technology, the way energy is consumed, the way things are manufactured, the way things are mechanized, and how that has changed the human experience. This is a sweet, photo. When you look at this photo, it's like this idea that like a human being is like inside the machine or whatever. We'll kind of get to that. Is that the way we've gone? Do we really run the machines? Are they running us? I don't know. We'll get there by the end maybe. Increased global integration. This may be a little bit less familiar, but in a sense, you already all know about this too. Over the last 500 years or so, people around the world have become deeply intertwined in a way that they simply weren't before. 500 years ago, your family was part of a village. Probably. They might have been part of a city, but probably not. And most of their world revolved around the village. They didn't leave the village really. They didn't know about things outside the village, and stuff like that just didn't matter. You were part of a local community. So that's really changed. Now everything's kind of tied together. By the point we're at now, it's really difficult to think of things that aren't tied together. For example, if you're wearing shoes, check out where those shoes are made, right? So you get rubber from Malaysia that's shipped to Vietnam that are, made into shoes that are then sewn together back in Indonesia that are then shipped to, Atlanta. But the company that makes those shoes is based in Oregon, all this sort of stuff, right? So all of these sort of integration processes we know for just like some material. A lot of our food comes from Mexico, for example, right? So you know about these sort of connections, these sort of commodity chains, but we'll also look at how that works with culture. Maybe some of you are into anime or K-pop, or you really like French movies or something like that. Well, that's something that 100 years ago most people wouldn't have thought of or wouldn't have had access to, right? So all of these new connections, how does that work? What is that building? Where is that taking us? Is there any sort of danger there? Is there any sort of problems, or is it just, kind of all good? Then we'll look at political participation and how that's changed over the last 500 years or so. Most of you, whether you're like switched onto it or not, are probably involved in some sort of political activities, whether that's voting or talking about politics or having some, deeply held opinions about this or that. It's definitely a modern phenomenon. People didn't used to participate in politics in the same way for lots of reasons we'll kind of look at. And we'll try to get a sense of how it's different in every society. It doesn't necessarily mean democratic. So here is a poster from communist China early on during the Cultural Revolution. This is not a democratic movement, but it is definitely a movement of the people. So lots and lots of people are involved in politics in undemocratic ways, but in a sense, that's them being involved in ways they weren't really before, right? So we'll look at this idea that individuals are part of the individual political process, which might sound a little bit strange, but don't worry, we'll get there too. It's just something to keep on the back burner. People are becoming more sort of political and more involved in the government around them and how things are supposed to run. Next, we'll look at mass society. This looks cool, right? These people are watching like a 3D movie or something. So mass society kind of starts when people all start doing the same thing. This is a little bit tricky, but one way you might think about it is as globalization increased, as people started to be more into nation states, which is the next one we'll get to in a second, they started to do the same things. And so whereas before there were sort of lots of different cultures and foods and languages and media, it's all being sort of compressed. So all around the world, right, more and more people are learning English over the last 100 years, for example, and English has definitely come to be the dominant language that you have to learn if you grow up in, I don't know, Venezuela or something. You better learn English, right? If you want to like make it. That's the idea anyway. Well, where does that come from? That's really strange. Or most of you have probably seen a Marvel movie in the last little bit here. Maybe not in the last year. You didn't go out to the movies anyway, but you might have seen it. You did the Disney Channel, right? You watching that. So if we all watch the same movies and we all listen to the same music, turn on the radio, right, and surf around, it's like the same 20 songs over and over again. We mostly kind of all wear the same clothes and stuff. Where does that take us? Are we becoming sort of more and more homogenous? That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is in the modern period, you can start talking about the average person or users or consumers or followers. And what happens when you start to see the world this way? What happens when you start to think about the people around you, or people like out there, as uh, not necessarily individuals, but just part of society? It's something new, it's something different. We'll check it out. And then finally, we'll talk about the nation state and nationalism. This is a little bit tricky. We'll definitely get into it. But things like nation states are not very old. In previous human societies, you have things like empires, kingdoms, villages, stuff like that. In many ways, the United States is actually the first nation state. So we'll get to what that means. What is a nation state? How do people come to see themselves as sort of citizens of a nation? If you've ever traveled outside of the country, you know that it's like totally different. If you're from the United States and you go to like Germany or Japan or something, people are like, oh, you're American. And then they have a bunch of ideas about you based on that. Or if you grew up in Jamaica or something, and then you come to the United States, but now you and your family are Americans, people are confused about this sometimes. And they're like, well, are you from America? Are you American? Are you Jamaican? And the people themselves, right, can be confused about this in a sense. You can be like, well, yeah, I'm American, but my family's Jamaican, right? And so there's lots of different stuff going on. We'll try to sort that out and see what we can make of that. Then we'll talk a little bit about nationalism. What is it? What does it mean? It gets thrown around a lot, particularly recently. In the last 5 or 10 years, people have been talking more about it. But we'll try to sort of pin down what it is, how it works, how people sort of come to identify themselves as a thing. For most Americans, one of the first ways they identify themselves is American. But that's really strange. There's lots of different ways you can identify, by gender, by race, by class, by member of community, by what you do, by whether you're single or married, all this sort of stuff, right? But just being American has become a really big part of people's identity. Well, what does that mean? It's totally true all over the place. If you go up in France, you feel French. Well, how did that happen? That's not natural, it's not organic. It's a thing that developed over the last couple hundred years. So we'll look at that too. So that's it for this first one. Just kind of throwing out ideas, throwing out what we're going to do, how you're grading, this idea about the modules. Look at the quiz, go ahead and get on that. Look at the written response, go ahead and get on that. Remember, you don't have any reading to do or anything like that. Just get working on it. Please, you will have questions. Email me those questions. I will get back to you right away. I'll also send out an announcement with some additional sort of stuff in it, or writing some of this stuff out, so make sure you look out for those. Only the first 3 modules will be open fully right now, and then Monday I'll put out the next 2, and then the next Monday I'll put out the next 2. But I'll tell you all about that in that announcement. Otherwise, get working on the stuff, send me any questions, and talk to you again soon.